brilliant young freshman congressmen from many parts of the country, determined to stop America's drift toward bankruptcy and appeasement. Perhaps their numbers might even include future senators or a president. And time has dashed that latter hope, but some of these freshmen of 1960, 1961 did go on to very long and productive careers, such as John Ashford from Ohio and John Tower from Texas. As well as reporting on the activities and triumphs of conservative youth organization, National Review served as a clearinghouse to notify interested young readers of programs in which they could participate. So they were aware of their youth readership and specifically reaching out to them. On June 17th, for example, the This Week column directed college students considering formation of a campus conservative club to obtain a copy of the ISI Leadership Guide, a manual available free from the Intercollegiate Society of Individualists that included advice on handling logistics of organizing a club, planning events, and raising money, as well as providing a short list of conservative books and periodicals, a sample announcement letter and constitution, and the Sharon Statement of the Young Americans for Freedom. So basically it was a complete kit. And National Review, for this and for many other things, also provided full mailing information. The period under discussion in this paper closes with the construction of the Berlin Wall, and a sense of weariness on the part of his staff, fatigued from 8 months of sounding the alarm against communist expansionism. Of the wall itself, the editors wrote, as so often with Khrushchev's words and conduct, it exhibited a kind of peasant fantasy raised to an end totalitarian power. If your cattle are slipping over to your hated neighbor's field, just build a long, ugly wall to contain them. No matter how ridiculous, however, the wall represented a serious action, and by doing nothing, the West accepted the political meaning as well as the physical consequences of this action. With the wall and the West's refusal to physically oppose its construction, the significance of Berlin was over. The magazine argued that it has been a direct confrontation of East and West at and through Berlin that gave the city its transcendent importance. This gone, Khrushchev can let Berlin wither on the enfeebled Western vines. Things still could be done to counter the Soviets' actions. Senator Thomas Dodd had called, among other ideas, for a truth airlift of journalists from all over the world to Berlin, for embargoes and for resumption of nuclear tests. But the magazine concluded that there was no reason on the record to suppose that any of them will be done. In sum, then, the first months of the Kennedy administration were a time of darkness and frustration for conservatives like those of National Review, but there was cause for them not to despair. If the United States could survive long enough to bring them to maturity, a new generation of conservative youth might just save the nation from oblivion. National Review functioned as informant and clearinghouse, voice of warning and encourager to the conservative movement of the early 1960s. Upon this foundation would grow a movement that, while controversial, has been undeniably successful over the course of the past almost 5 decades. Thank you very much.
I'm going to briefly comment on the paper, but I want to preface it by just saying that Laura and I come from very different disciplines that have different approaches to examining research questions and take different methodological approaches. So some of my comments may not be necessarily as applicable to a historian as it may to a political scientist. Overall, I really did enjoy different papers, and her research seems to really be a provocative issue, particularly one, at least to my knowledge, that hasn't been explored before. And we often think about the 1960s and we think of that the start of the basic liberalism and liberal movement, and we move into the later 60s and 70s and have the civil rights movement as well as the women's liberation movement and the environmental movement then begins. In her paper, she begins to examine the origins of the conservative movement and basically is looking at how the liberal activism that we tend to think about in the 1960s, that wasn't the only movement that was really going on, and that she's basically making this argument that the National Review was one of these outlets for conservatives and was the beginning of a conservative movement. In terms of the methodological approach that Gifford looks at and focuses on, I do have a couple questions, and one being that it's unclear in terms of what articles were actually analyzed in the National Review. So it may be a good idea to put together a framework to show the reader these are the articles that were examined, if they were certain types of articles, if they were editorial pieces, and then to just give that framework to understanding if they were maybe articles just focusing on foreign policy, or they were also focusing on domestic policy as well. Also, it's unclear on whether there were any articles during the period of time that you looked at that took the liberal position, even in the National Review. Meaning that was it completely taking that conservative view in terms of what should be going on in foreign policy, particularly some things that were going on within JFK's early presidency. You may want to talk to you a little bit about whether or not this was the only media outlet for the conservative position. Were we seeing any sort of conservative discussion, possibly with electronic media, in terms of over the radio, or even in different newspapers across the country, or maybe another actual journal? It would also be interesting to compare and contrast the National Review with other publications, possibly ones that took the liberal position or even the conservative position, to see how the origins of the liberal versus the conservative movement, how they were possibly similar or how they were different. And in order to provide greater support for your argument, you may want to think about how public opinion changed over time, especially from the 1960s maybe to the end of JFK's presidency, or even possibly through 1970, by looking at public opinion polls. There is a study that's done on I believe it's a yearly basis, called the General Social Science Survey. And they talk about, and they ask the respondents a number of different questions regarding how they gain political information and what their views are politically. And then just being able to compare that to see, well, maybe the National Review or these media outlets influence public opinion. And this is just give you a little bit greater generalizability, because you're going to be able to focus on and predict what future behavior might be, because it's going to be important to see, okay, this is the start of the conservative movement, but then it goes on for decades. Also on page 10, you talk a little bit about how the readership of National Review remains divided regarding what positive programs conservatives should promote in place of the dangerous federal growth, basically making the argument that government is getting too big. But it might be interesting to look at if there were other groups that also take this position. So we're talking about conservatives as an entire group, but looking at some of the subgroups within that, and seeing what were their actual arguments regarding this problem of federal growth. Also on page 13, we talk a little bit about how there were a number of groups that began and were initiated surrounding this conservative movement, and giving some examples in terms of what some of those actual groups were. And then you talk also a little bit about how National Review started having a regular feature that wasn't an advertisement, but it basically gave an outlet for people to talk about particular issues and young readers within the conservative movement. It'd be interesting to just have a little bit more background on that. Another comment that you have is talking about that you basically say this is the beginning of the conservative movement, but we don't see the right-wing conservative movement really starting, at least strongly, until the early 1980s when Reagan comes into office, and you have that right-wing movement really begin, and it comes to go on for a while. To just looking at what possibly, just some examples of what the conservative movement consisted of before the 1980s. You might also want to talk about the implications of the conservative movement in talking in terms of what is the major significance of this, what were some things that they were able to accomplish. Were some of the conservative presidents, were they able to really focus on some of these issues that were discussed within the National Review? And then also maybe comparing and contrasting how organized this movement was in terms of some of the other movements. And basically, you could almost frame it as this was a social movement to some extent, but in terms of a liberal or a conservative ideology, and then compare it to the more liberal movements such as the civil rights movement or even the women's liberation movement.